So good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth Wisdom Research presentation by Dr. David Rooney. As you can see, the topic of the presentation is Limits of Social Science through the Prisms of Wisdom and Quantum Mechanics. I would like to extend a special welcome to Dr. Rooney, who is Honorary Professor of Management and Organization Studies at Macquarie Business School, Sydney, Australia. He has researched, taught, and published widely in the areas of wisdom, leadership, the knowledge-based economy, and the creative industries. Professor Rooney has published in major academic journals, including the Leadership Quarterly, Human Relations, AMLE, and Journal of Business Ethics. Just to keep the timer, we'll have the presentation for an hour, and thereafter the floor will be open for Q&A. And without further ado, I would kindly like to invite Professor Rooney to share his presentation and insights. So over to you, Professor.
Great. Thank you, Shalini, and thank you, Surya, for making this happen, and thank you everyone for joining in this this Zoom presentation. The title of the presentation is way more scary than the actual content, so try and relax a little bit. It's really just some, at one level, we're just talking about some basic questions around the philosophy of social science and research methodology. So, and wisdom and quantum mechanics just provide good vehicles to talk about how we think about research methods and the scientific method generally. So I just need to slightly reorganize my screen here. So we're going to basically be talking about two things, ontology and epistemology, tonight, and how we can think about ontology and epistemology in terms of, in a sense, measuring context. And context is something that we do a really bad job of measuring in quantitative social science. Qualitative social science is pretty comfortable with context, but once we get into a quantitative realm, we really struggle, and there are some very basic roadblocks that most people are not aware of that actually prevent that that agility in dealing with context. And the reason I'm focusing on context is because in both wisdom, if we define what wisdom is, and particularly if we follow Aristotle, then wisdom is basically determined by the context. And the reason why I'm using quantum physics is because in quantum physics, at the quantum level of reality, everything is context. Like almost nothing other than context. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the solutions that have been devised by physicists for dealing with this context. But it's more than context, it's also to do with subjectivity as well. And so I'll look at raise a few questions about how we think about doing wisdom research, and then raise a few questions generally about where we might go in terms of quantitative social science generally. So, so let's get on with that. If I can get my screen to change. There we go. So, a couple of you might have done one of the courses that I've done in Bombay, where we've either talked about writing a thesis or around doing research methods. But if you haven't, then you may not know terribly much about what ontology actually means. So ontology and epistemology go together, and people generally have at least a basic knowledge of what epistemology means, and that's to do with knowledge and creating knowledge. Although it actually means more than that. It's really about understanding the nature of knowledge, as well as, which you need to understand how to create knowledge. But ontology comes before that. So ontology is where you say, okay, if the phenomena that I want to research is A, then what is it like? What is it made of? What's all of its components? And how is that connected to the rest of reality? So we have to wrestle with those problems so that we can describe what it is and then define it. And if we define it, then we can also set out our assumptions about the nature of that thing and how it exists in reality, even when some of those things can't be accurately measured. So in all research, we have to make some assumptions about reality. And some of them are not measurable assumptions, but we can make those assumptions in a very informed and educated manner that we can then go ahead to justify. So in terms of epistemology, then we say, okay, well, if that's what this thing is made of, these are all the components that are part of it. So if we think of wisdom, we can think that it possibly has hundreds of components. Then we come up with a definition that is commensurate with that description that we have, and we can think, okay, so if that's what it's like, these are the kinds of methods we're going to employ to collect the data. So what kind of data? How will we collect it? And also, once we've got that data, how do we organize it? How do we structure it? How do we analyze it? And how do we interpret it? Because to my way of thinking in research methods, you have to have a method and a methodology and a method on the data collection side, but also on the analysis and interpretation side as well. And we need to be able to think very clearly about how we do all of that measurement stuff and analysis stuff and interpretation stuff. And if we can't think clearly about that, then you really have to question whether the research you're doing is reliable and valid. You know, it could be completely invalid. You know, you might have done the ontological work that comes up with a valid definition of whatever it is that you're doing research on, but your research design may not be true to that definition. And so at that methodological level, the methods that you have chosen to deploy to create the knowledge that you want to create may not be the right methods. So that's a kind of starting point. And so you really do need to understand this to be a clear thinking social scientist in terms of research design. And these questions are important when you're dealing with really difficult constructs. And I can't think of a more difficult social scientific construct than wisdom itself. And part of the reason for that is because if you follow the Aristotelian tradition, then you're saying, well, it's, you know, wisdom might have a bunch of components that need to somehow come together, but what determines how those components should come together is the context, and context is big. But we'll talk about that bigness in a little while. And I guess the next point I would make is that for me, I want social science to actually matter in the real world. And, you know, we all work in a business school, and we want the research we do to have direct impact and relevance for the students we teach, but also for the communities that we live in, including, you know, not just our business communities, but society at large, and including at a global level. And if we're not good at dealing with context, that seriously limits the extent to which we can have that impact that we would like to have, particularly when you look at the world at the moment, where the context that we live in includes a pandemic, so a COVID pandemic. We've got climate change and all of the fallout from that as it hits different kinds of environments. We've got a whole set of questions about the decline of liberal democracy around the world and the rise of autocratic regimes and demagogues like Donald Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil, who Tadi will tell us is about to be booted out of government. And then we're seeing all of those different geopolitical tensions, which people in India are feeling with the tensions on the border with China up in the northeast of the country, but which we feel on a daily basis in Australia with trade sanctions from China. And then we look at the issues around Taiwan and so on. But also, you know, India itself is growing in its influence around the world, and at some level that creates even discomfort within India itself that needs to be dealt with. And then the leadership crisis, which is pertinent to a research centre that's interested in leadership. And you know, I'm not the only person who does leadership research that says that there is actually a crisis of leadership, and that it's a global crisis, both at the corporate level and at a political level. And so I'm asking myself, you know, where are the answers from the social sciences to all of these problems? And I'm not seeing a lot of answers because these problems that I've just listed continue to get worse. And so part of the problem may well be that people don't want to listen to us. They don't want to know what we think. But maybe that's also because they don't really believe that we have solutions anyway. And maybe they're true. Maybe they're correct in thinking that. And if we are really struggling to provide the answers that the world needs to deal with these kinds of problems, whether it's at the level of political science, the level of economics, the level of psychology, the level of sociology or education or whatever it happens to be, then is one of the problems that our constructs and also our methods and our methodologies, are they really fit for purpose today, given the complexity that we face and the sheer scale of contextual elements that impact on our lives, which partly is magnified by globalization and the internet and all of that sort of stuff. And I've already mentioned the Aristotelian approach to wisdom, which basically says that context really, really matters. Right. So if wisdom is all about context, and we look at what the physicists are telling us about reality at its most fundamental level in the universe, that is the quantum level of reality, well, they're saying that that's all context as well. So quantum field theory, for example, basically says that there's this field that permeates the entire universe. Nobody really knows what it's made of, and particles pop out of that field. So that field is a context. And so what they do is they break it down into chunks that are like, which they call Hilbert space. And Hilbert space is a space out of which some aspect of reality emerges. And in general mathematics, they might just call that a superposition. So it's a superposition of, it's like a super collection of variables, random variables that are part of the context. So in what quantum physicists have done is they've said, okay, so if that's the way reality is at that level, at the most fundamental level of the universe, then we've got some problems because there is no concrete reality in the way we perceive it in our day-to-day life. Everything is uncertain. There's huge amounts of randomness, and there's an unimaginably large number of variables all potentially interacting with each other. And also there are problems around, okay, so if we think about what is the most fundamental thing, there are a bunch of speculative theories about what that might be. So one theory is that it's information. Another theory is that it's mathematics itself. Another theory is that it's consciousness. Another theory is that it's value in the philosophical sense. And another theory is that it's God or some godlike thing. Nobody knows whether any of those are true, or if one of them is true, which one is true. But if one of those is true, it's telling us that the most fundamental aspect of reality is non-material. It is not matter. And and it has some element of, I don't know, some sort of proto-element of our consciousness or mentality or something like that, that enables it to create matter and the reality that we experience as we go in through our lives. Now, from a social science perspective, we don't have to wrestle with answering those fundamental questions about the nature of the universe. What we're best advised to do, I think, is to look at how those physicists have gone about restructuring their approach to research so that they can deal with all of this uncertainty. So if we look at social contexts, they're full of uncertainty. They often feel like they're completely random, even if they're not completely random, but they are largely random. They're very indeterminate. So this is not a deterministic Newtonian mechanical world anymore at a quantum physics level. And how do they model this stuff? How do they predict? How do they measure? All of these things are problems that they've already overcome in physics. And they've had to ignore the basic tenets of Newtonian mechanics upon which classical scientific methods are built, right? So, and this is the kind of classical kind of approach to the scientific method is the method that we've employed fairly uncritically within the social sciences. But there is now an emerging field called quantum social science, or I prefer to call it quantum-like social science. And so we see that in decision-making research and in some areas of cognitive science and some areas of economics. I personally think it's very unsophisticated and not particularly useful at the moment, but there's the beginning of a movement that says, well, if all of these tools have been developed and these physicists, who probably are the smartest people on this planet, they're way smarter than we are, have been able to sort through all of these problems by looking at the basic ontological problems that they face. And it turns out that those basic ontological problems are very similar to the problems that we face in the social sciences. Why aren't we learning from them? Or why aren't more of us learning from them? That's part of the problem that I want to address today. And particularly all of that ambiguity and indeterminacy. And also, there's a subjectivity element here in quantum physics. So they talk about the observer, and that as a scientist observes what happens at a quantum level, that process of observation influences what actually happens. Okay, so there's a subjectivity in there, a human-like subjectivity, and whether it's really true or not, we don't know. But most physicists who work in this area assume that it is true. It's not our job to decide whether it is true. We're, again, better off thinking, well, okay, so if they've figured out ways to mathematically deal with subjectivity and consciousness and information and all of that sort of stuff, which is all part of the psychological and sociological dimension of a human life, can't we take something from them that's useful? Okay, and even things are so ambiguous at this level that at the moment, we've always thought about an atom as having a nucleus and all of these particles spinning around it like a little solar system. And it turns out that's not true. An atom is just a fuzzy blob, and particles are not solid objects. They're more like smears across space. And even at that level, it's questionable whether space even exists, because space-time go together, as Einstein told us. And you've got the non-locality issue where particles can be entangled, but they could be thousands, even millions of light years apart, and they somehow communicate instantly with each other. So that's faster than the speed of light, which is not supposed to be possible. So if it is possible at that level, then there must be no space or time space or space-time. So we can be, in a sense, using some of the tools that they use for measuring looking at non-locality in how people's minds get locked together. So groupthink and things like that. So these are basic ontological problems that the physicists have had to deal with, and they've done a lot of and it's not unusual. In fact, it's very common to hear quantum physicists talking in a very informed way about ontology, but it's very rare to hear that sort of same conversation happening in the social sciences, particularly amongst people who are predominantly quantitative researchers. Right. So, oh yes, and another part here is, so Anthony Giddens, the guy, the British sociologist who came up with the idea of structuration theory, he talked about what he called the double hermeneutic, which basically says that it's impossible to be objective about doing research on the human condition if you are a human, right? Because you are actually part of it. And the same thing happens with the observer issue in quantum physics. So if you're an observer, you are actually part of the experiment that you're doing. You cannot be separated from it. And all the measurement apparatus that you use in that experiment is also part of the phenomena that you are trying to do research on. So there's a whole question about the possibility of objectivity. So in a lot of ways, some quantum physicists actually would have a lot in common with some fairly extreme postmodern theory. about reality, which is really quite interesting in and of itself. And but whereas at the extreme ends of postmodern research or theory, they don't make any room for measurement or quantification, whereas the physicists do. And as I say, they've developed those tools. Okay, so I've said most of that already. Oh yeah, so epistemological ambiguity is an important thing here. So there's a kind of humility, I think, in us saying, well, you know, we've done the ontological work, and then we've used that to design our study, design our data collection, design our analysis, and to think about how we interpret it. And we're going to try and create knowledge about it, but we have to recognise how provisional that knowledge has to be, given all of the uncertainty about everything else that we've dealt with. And I heard Richard Dawkins speaking the other day. The guy, he's a bit of a nutcase, to be honest, but he's very, very well regarded in scientific terms and biology circles in particular. And he was talking about truth and science being the arbiter of truth, but a fundamental tenet of the scientific method is that all knowledge is provisional. So it's not about truth, really. And I think when we look at this kind of ontological set of problems that the physicists have faced, and we see the modesty in their epistemological claims as they talk about the most fundamental levels of reality, it's something that we should all actually learn from, and it's actually quite a wise thing to do. And often they'll, you know, when we get to those 5 possibilities for what is most fundamental: consciousness, information, mathematics, value, and God, some of them can hold very firm views about their particular thing having supremacy over the other 4. They'll all begin by saying, look, I don't know, but this is my best guess. And I think that's something that we should all adopt in our own work. So let's have a look at where we're at. So quantum physics is like over 100 years old now, and just over 100 years old, I think. And so this process of revising fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and how that should impact on research methods has been going on in science for a long time. And in the social sciences, we haven't really kept up with that. As I said, there are some people now moving towards using quantum-like social science methods. But by and large, and if I look at the 2 kind of worst examples of not keeping up would be economics and psychology. And there's this kind of slavish adherence to what is now really actually an outdated set of ideas about how to do research. If you look at the social ontologies that we've got to deal with, and there's a very good argument for us shifting. So if everything is context, and if fundamental reality is not really countable in a simple sense, that interpretation is unavoidable. So in quantum theory, it's nearly all interpretations of mathematical models, and the one mathematical model could be interpreted in quite a range of different ways. So one way of interpreting quantum theory and mathematical models is to say that, well, we live in a universe of universes, so the multiverse model appears. So, which seems extreme, but it is actually, and I have problems accepting it. So one of the things that you have to understand about quantum physics is that it's just unbelievably weird. It's seriously weird, and it's seriously hard to grasp that a lot of what they talk about is actual reality, that, you know, the particles hundreds of billions of light years apart can communicate instantly. It's hard to imagine that. It's hard to imagine that particles are just smears rather than little kind of tiny little specks of matter. It's really difficult to understand a lot of this, but interpretation is unavoidable. And we kind of pretend a little bit in the social sciences that, oh, well, it's only the qualitative people that do interpretive stuff. Well, actually, no, it's not. Everyone does interpretation. Even if you're a hardcore quantitative researcher, you've got your tables and you're looking at all the different values that your analysis has pumped out, and you're saying what it means, and saying what it means is an interpretation. So we all do it, but in quantum physics, it's much more. It's out there on the table. People are very open about it, and one of the really interesting things about quantum physics is that there's this pretty open flow of debate between the scientists and the philosophers. Not all scientists welcome that, but it does happen pretty regularly, and I think that's a very healthy thing. And then there's all the whole set of questions about objectivity. So we're used to this classical worldview where everything looks, you know, tables look like solid objects, and planets fly through the universe as solid objects, you know, and we take what we think are objective measurements of them, and they work very well, it has to be said. But at some level, reality is illusory. And we also know that our own perceptual apparatus is heavily biased towards kind of making stuff up. And but the really weird thing that keeps haunting me is that in the social sciences, when we get everything really, really, really 100% right, we can predict with at best 80% accuracy. But in quantum physics, it's 100% accurate 100% of the time. It seems extraordinary. Given all of that uncertainty, the lack of objectivity, the indeterminacy, and all of that sort of stuff, how can they be 100% accurate in their predictions 100% of the time? How do they do that? Well, it's not. We don't really need to understand how they do it. I think what we can do is say, well, what are the tools you're using? Because somehow there must be a way that we can use them to deal with the complexity of social reality that we as researchers need to take account of. And I've already said that that we're actually pretty weak in the social sciences overall at thinking ontologically. People in the humanities are better at it, way better at it than us, and particularly in philosophy. And within the social sciences, the qualitative people are probably better at it than the quant people. But overall, there's an overarching problem, you know. So, you know, I think of all the research I read around mindfulness And when I read it and I look at what they're measuring, if I look at the items on their scales, I'm saying, but this is not measuring mindfulness. They say it's mindfulness, but all they're doing is measuring concentration, usually. Well, mindfulness is much more than concentration, way more. So, I think that's a real problem that we face in the social sciences. And when I look at the assumptions that economists make about people, that we're all selfish, rational optimizers, it's an ontological mistake of gigantic proportions. And it's no wonder that economists can't predict anything at all. So, I mean, I should be fair. I think economics has started to wake up to some of these issues, and we're seeing quite a bit of movement in economics over the past 10 years to more realistic understandings. But one of the reasons why economic rationalism has been an abject failure is because it's been based on unsustainable ontological assumptions about the nature of social reality or the nature of economic reality. In fact, it even really assumes that economic reality is all there is and that there's no social or cultural reality, and that social and cultural and economic reality are not somehow intertwined with environmental reality. And as I say there, we can't afford these kinds of indulgences anymore, because the kinds of problems that we face around the world are really pressing on us. And I just this afternoon, I was listening to the news on the car radio, and they were saying that on every continent in the world in this year, 2022, has recorded the highest number of extreme weather events in history. That's every single continent has recorded that now. So, so I think that there's an imperative there that we need to be better at responding to. And I'll just mention positivism, because positivism, logical positivism, was a well-intentioned idea that was based on faulty ontological assumptions, and it assumed that by simply being rational and quantitative, you could solve all the problems on Earth. And remember, in the 1920s, it's sort of still in the shadow of World War I, where a lot of really weird stuff was happening at political levels. And these people were saying, look, if government could be more rational and they could base their decision-making on science, then the world would be better governed. We wouldn't have another world war, and everyone would live in peace and prosperity. And while you can understand them wanting to make that argument, and you can understand that people would be hopeful that just letting science be in charge of all the decisions was actually not a bad idea. But history now tells us that didn't really work. And it didn't work because the fundamentals were not really thought through properly. So, it's a fiction to think that everything can be done in a purely rational way, and that all people can behave in purely rational ways. And if they could, it'd be an incredibly boring world. But it might be peaceful, but it'd be boring, and we'd all die of just completely going out of our brains with boredom. So a better approach, I think most of the people linked to the centre would agree, is rather than just letting science and rationality make all the decisions, why don't we inject some wisdom into the process of government, into the process of business, and into the process of just living a life. And wisdom is not just about employing rationality. Rationality is part of it. Logic is part of it. And Aristotle would have definitely agreed with that. But there has to be more to it because, we do live in a very indeterministic world. There is a lot of randomness in it. And it's impossible for humans to be purely rational about everything, or even most things. So we have to somehow account for that reality, that we can't be purely rational, that we are emotional. And, Kahneman's work on fast and slow cognitive systems kind of acknowledges that there is this emotional system that operates at much, much faster speed than our cognitive processes do, which is where we do our rational work. And cognitive behavior therapy is based on the idea that what you have to do is intervene at that emotional coloring of your cognition to make it more rational and reasoned. But nevertheless, we're left with having to acknowledge the idea that you can't rule emotion and other non-rational aspects of everyday human existence out of our research equations about solving the problems of the world that are in front of us. One of the things that I've been noticing in recent years is a tendency in the social sciences and particularly in the quantitative social sciences, but the qualitative social sciences should not be let off scot-free on this. But we say, okay, why don't we come up with parsimonious definitions of the phenomena that we want to do our research on, so that they fit in our kind of toolkit better. So we've got a toolkit of theories and models, and we've got a toolkit of analytical tools. And what ends up happening is that, and like I said, with the example of the research done on mindfulness, they reduce the definition of what mindfulness is down to something that they're very comfortable with dealing with, and they've already got the tools for doing that. And I get that because we're all under pressure to publish, because it's publish or perish regime that we work under. So I kind of get that subconscious pressure to go down the easy path, but it's not the most virtuous path for researchers to go down. And I would rather us say, no, let's, and I've recently seen people now starting to talk about, well, let's get a scientific definition of whatever it is we're researching. And I'm saying, no, let's just get an ontological definition that reflects reality. And then let's look at what tools we need. And then if we don't have all the tools in our current toolkit, where else can we go? Okay, so maybe we look at doing a mixed method design where we have some qualitative and quantitative approaches. Maybe we look at doing using some standard social science statistical tools along with some of the tools, statistical tools that they use in quantum physics to deal with our problems. So I'm asking a lot, and this is not easy, quick work, which is what we all want. But at the end of the day, if our real job is about solving those problems that we have that are global and really pressing upon us, if we want to be part of the solution, then we've got to get past the quick research outcome mentality that we're all so caught up in. And I know it's not, it's hard if you're a junior researcher and you're getting pressed all the time to produce research outcomes and get your citation rates up and get in highly cited journals and all of that sort of stuff. It's kind of hard to resist that. But at some level, we've all got to do our bit to kind of push knowledge forward in much more constructive ways. So, I am genuinely concerned about whether we can remain relevant as social scientists. So let's talk a little bit about wisdom, and so the approach that Bernard and I developed, which we call social practice wisdom, which is kind of a variation of Aristotle's practical wisdom, or phronesis, as it's known in Greek. It's a construct in a sense, it's not a measurable construct, but because Bernard and I are both primarily qualitative researchers and in particular discourse analysis researchers, we're very interested in context, and we're very interested in the complexity of social phenomena. And so we did a lot of work on trying to distill what is Aristotle really trying to say to us? What is he really telling us about the nature of wisdom? And really Aristotle is saying two very important things. One is that wisdom is situated. So what wisdom looks like depends on the situation you face. Okay, so if I'm facing a situation in hand-to-hand combat in the jungles of Vietnam or South America, and I've got to make decisions, life or death decisions, the sorts of resources I need to draw upon in that kind of situation are very different to a different situation where if I'm a corporate CEO and I'm getting pressure from shareholders to be more socially responsible, and I need to make decisions pretty quickly before the next annual general meeting, which I need to present a strategy to shareholders, and particularly the institutional shareholders, about how I'm going to change the way this company operates so that we're more socially responsible. It's a completely different set of resources that you need to assemble. So in that respect, the context, the situation, in other words, is telling us, okay, in this situation, you need resources A, B, C, D, and E, and you need these ratios of each of those, if you like to put it very simply. But he's also saying that, well, practical wisdom is a virtue. It's one of the virtues, and in fact, it's the most important virtue, because it draws upon the moral and the intellectual virtues, but it's the executive process where you integrate the intellectual and the ethical or moral, if you like, and you decide what ought to be done and how it ought to be done and why and at what time and what the outcomes should be. So a context can really have, for all practical purposes, could have an infinite number of variables in it. So that's a lot. And the kind of resources that you might need to draw together in a specific situation are numerous. So there's a whole bunch of psychological resources. There's a whole bunch of even biological resources that you need to do, because at the end of the day, Aristotle is saying you have to be able to do wise things. So you actually have to be practical in the real world and do the things that make a difference. So it means you have to somehow get your body to do what it needs to do. And that includes getting other people's bodies to do what needs to be done. So motivating other people. So you need to be able to communicate, which has a very clear physical bodily element to it. And it's not just intellectual reasoning, it's also moral reasoning, and there's emotions that come into play and levels of maturity, and all of those sorts of things all need to be drawn together. And there's there's theoretical reasoning, and there's reasoning based on your life experience, your experience in the world. So it's a very complex set of personal resources that you bring into play. But of course, a wise person, and particularly if you're a wise leader, then you're going to say, well, who are the people around me that I'm going to recruit to help to solve, you know, global poverty or food insecurity or whatever it is that we want to try and get on top of. So then there's even more sets of variables coming into play. So it's a very, very complex thing. Now, of course, we can say, look, okay, but like every person only ever faces a limited number of situations, and that's true, and that makes it a bit easier. And there's only a certain number of people who we might want to work with, and that narrows that infinite field of variables down considerably from what it is in theoretical terms. And that's very true, but it's still a very large number of resources that we need to bring into play. And although, you know, we have scales out there for measuring wisdom, and Monica Ardelt's scale, a three-dimensional wisdom scale, is the main one that people use, and it you know, it does a great job. But at some level, to me, and you know, and Bernard and I have used that scale ourselves in previous research. But at some level, I'm always still left with the suspicion that how can a single scale really know that it's capturing all the right variables that it should measure, given the situation that we're thinking about facing? I mean, you can't know that really, and we can't give people, you know, 8,000 different instruments, you know, measuring themselves on a 5-point Likert scale as they face a situation. That would just be impractical. You just couldn't do it. So again, I'm looking at, well, what if we could employ some of those tools that the physicists have developed for dealing with the same kinds of ontological problems in a different domain, in the quantum domain? What if we could model wisdom? What if we could create computer models of wisdom where we had huge Hilbert spaces full of contextual variables, and we had individuals who have their own set of variables, personal variables, and wisdom-like capacities that they can draw? And why couldn't we design kinds of tests over vast numbers of different kinds of situations to figure out, well, what are all of these different combinations of variables that these individuals or small groups of individuals need to pull together? And can we begin to develop some general rules about those, and about what general rules about different sorts of situations? And we could do that in the political or policy realm. We could do that in the corporate boardroom realm, and lots of other realms. I know this is a big project, and I know that it's a long way off us being able to do that, but I'm saying that it's something that we can at least begin to aim at the moment. But we need to be able to think very clearly about all of those ontological and epistemological questions that I've already canvassed. Now, I'm just checking my watch here to see how I'm doing. I need to just speed up a little bit here. So I've already said all of the things on this particular slides, but I'm saying there possibly the most interesting methodological question is, can we employ wisdom theory rather than only epistemology to create new research designs? Because typically in the social sciences, we're not really looking at ontology as part of our thinking through what our methodology is. We're just thinking in terms of epistemology. And I'm thinking, well, rather than just talk about bringing epistemology and ontology together, why don't we bring a wisdom theoretic, so to understanding how we design research methods. So I'm not saying I know how to do that, but I'm putting it out there as a bit of a challenge. And it would actually make a really interesting PhD, actually. But as I say at the bottom there, we can discuss some of that at the end of the presentation if I leave enough time. Again, I've said all of those things, but I think given our ineffectiveness, or what I perceive as our ineffectiveness at presenting solutions to the world, to these larger problems, large global problems, I do think we need to think, at least think seriously about the social sciences getting on a different path to creating the solutions. We need to take philosophy of social science way more seriously than we do. And at some level, I'm being deliberately provocative today. Perhaps even you could say I'm being polemic, but I do feel seriously motivated to get people talking, because we really do face some major existential questions and problems bearing down on us right now. And I do think that the social sciences need to do a better job. And, just thinking about Einstein again, who said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get a different result. And I think we're a little bit guilty of that. And I think I need to stop there, and I think we can open up to some questions and discussion.
Thanks, Dr. David. So I think we already have Banajit with this question. Please go ahead.
Yes, sir, I liked your presentation.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for that. So part of the presentation was like epistemology. You talked about we should adopt the methods quantum mechanics to look at wisdom. But whereas I still feel that, as you have already mentioned, we are still not clear about what is wisdom. Mm-hmm. Unless we have more clarity on what is wisdom, it will be difficult to know what are the exact methodology we should apply. So,
yeah, that's a very interesting point, because epistemological uncertainty is a major part of doing quantum physics research. So you never have full knowledge of anything.
Yes.
You're always dealing with partial knowledge. Sure. And yet, despite the fact that they hardly know anything, they can still be 100% accurate 100% of the time. Yeah. So look, I agree with you, and Bernard might chip in at some point on this, but many years ago when we started on this journey, I remember us having a conversation where we said, look, before we really burrow into practical outcomes, we really have to try and figure out what wisdom is first, and we have to come up with a really sound theoretical basis. And I think both of us are still on that path, and I think the more knowledge we have, the better. But one of the lessons from quantum physics is that first of all, complete knowledge is unobtainable. We'll never have that, but it shouldn't stop us.
Yeah. So, I want to continue. So there's one problem in quantum mechanics, which is called the measurement problem.
Yeah.
So electrons have dual nature. It sometimes behaves as a wave and sometimes behaves as a particle. So this problem actually, so when a person is observing, so this is called the observation problem. So the particles behave, the energy or the electron, whatever, it behaves differently when you observe and when you do not observe.
Yeah.
So a lot of the thing is depending on the observer itself. So
Yeah.
here I would like to bring in, connect it to the social sciences. So if you look at wisdom from this side, so it can be like, in my view, two-way. How wisdom can be like how we deal outside in the world, but our dealings outside the world will not be perfect unless if we have some glasses putting on. So
Yeah.
we need to remove certain, so one way to look at would be like two-way, how we deal outside the world, that depends on my own how I am actually. So we can either look it from the outside world, how we behave in the world, or we may look in the internal things, how I am, what are the glasses I'm putting on.
Yeah.
So a part of the way wisdom actually says it is not about how wise I am. So if we can remove our negative tendencies, so I'm talking about the, like, from Eastern philosophy, what I have understood so far. So it is like removing all those things, layers and the glasses which are there, so that you can have a more of realistic or wise view about the world. You can actually be wise if you can drop all those lenses. So maybe, so that is what I wanted to contribute to the.
Yeah. So yeah, Banajit, I look, I agree with you. I think there's an important imperative that if we all want to become wiser in how we interact with the world, we do have to look within ourselves. And although I've spoken about Aristotle today, I'm also a student of Buddhist philosophy and psychology, and you know, in Buddhism, wisdom really means having clear understanding and clear insight about the fundamental nature of reality. And yeah, so I agree. I think we all have to take responsibility for our own clarity of vision, if I can put it like that. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. We have Alka. So Alka, you can go ahead.
So just continue. Hello, sir. That was a nice presentation. And just continuing on this discussion which you were having. So when you're talking about using wisdom as a method, right? So that's what I understood. It was a fairly heavy topic for me. So, you know, all the big words, quantum physics. But then, you know, if you're looking at wisdom and if you look at it internally, right? But here we are researchers. So when you look at it internally and you go and start looking at, you know, you're researching a problem, or you're looking at a broader, you're looking at a problem and you are, you know, a research problem. So when you look at it, take it internally, so the subjectiveness comes in. And your own interpretation as a researcher that interferes with, so wisdom would be more external, I believe. And it would be, so, you know, in terms of setting the context. So like, you know, if you see, there is a lot of research which is happening in developing countries context, you know, and that is my interest area. So that's why I'm talking about it. But so, you know, what happens is a lot of researchers from the West, they make the mistake of probably, or, you know, they overlook the fact that the developing countries have their own set, you know, like you talked about social sciences and all. So they have their own environment. Yeah. And with, so even the research problems, they look at it, they look at the research problems of a developing country, but from a developed country's context, you know, from what they have grown around. So, you know, so maybe like, you know, they have grown around things like social justice and equality, which is probably still on a, you know, it's coming up in most developing countries. So I think wisdom has to be more related to the context instead of, you know, I don't know if I'm right, how it is, because I'm just trying to interpret what you said. in
Yeah,
this?
so Alka, look, I agree with you, and you know, a fundamental issue is around, you know, it's the context that decides what wisdom looks like on any particular occasion. And actually, the whole purpose of or one of the main purposes of the centre is to really bring India and the West and other parts of the East into a dialogue around wisdom and leadership and related issues. And so, hearing a point of view like you've just expressed is actually really important, and it's part of what we're really trying to achieve here. And I think it's very true. And you know, the context that I live in is very different to what you live in Bombay. You know, I've lost count of how many times I've been to Bombay, but I know it pretty well, and I know that that when I'm there, the context is so radically different to what I'm used to, living on top of my little mountain here in the countryside in Queensland, staring down into the valley like a monk. But it's very true, and I really wish our journals were better capable of recognising that those contextual elements really, really matter in how, because as I said, you know, as researchers, we're all interpretive. It's just a matter of how much, the degree of interpretation that we do. So, and the way we interpret is very much conditioned by the context that we find ourselves in. And so that could be a fundamental part of using wisdom theory to underpin a research methodology and set of methods, is to say, well, I have to acknowledge the context that I come from and in which I'm doing this research, and that should impact on my interpretive outcomes, you know, when I'm writing up my discussion section, and that's important to acknowledge that, and it really matters, and that it actually helps to target the generalizability of the work you've done. So it may not be generalizable so that it would impact on anything in America, but it might be very generalizable to a whole bunch of other people who live in emerging economies. Yeah. Any more questions?
But just this thing clarifying. So you are saying that wisdom, we can use it as a, you know, methodology. Is it like a way to look at the methodology?
Yeah. I'm saying you can use wisdom theory as a foundation for developing a methodology. So methodology, you know, if we take methodology to mean the theoretical underpinnings of your choices of methods and your overall approach to doing the research. So yes, look, no one has done it yet, but I think it's a legitimate way to think about changing up how we do social scientific research.
Yeah. I can talk more, but then
I can see that
yeah.
Jagdish wants to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you. May I thank you, Professor Rooney. Such a delight listening to you. I couldn't agree more. Some very, very deep points here, and I hope we can meet very soon and learn more from you. I wanted to ask you, I know this is a session on methodology and research, but I wanted to ask you, how might you think, even as we engage in that area, you might go out to practice and begin to influence practice with some of those ideas, because we are a practitioner-based school, and I wanted to see if you could offer us some insights to directions or pathways into, even as we perfect and relook how research happens and how you know, frames are built, whether we can already take this to practice and begin to engage, and how might you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's I think it's something that we all think about in business schools, and a lot changed in 2007 when the global financial crisis began, and the President Obama said of Wall Street that there's a lot of information and knowledge on Wall Street, but not much wisdom. And things began to change then. So I think it's, certainly in Western countries, it's now not terribly weird to talk about wisdom in a practitioner environment. And I'm thinking that you could do the same thing in India as well. And I see Surya is nodding there. So I think people are quite open to talking openly about wisdom. And I think that's the first step, to make sure that people are actually receptive to the idea that wisdom might provide some answers. And I think people are so concerned these days about the nature of the sustainability of our political systems, the sustainability of our economic systems, the sustainability of our social systems, and the sustainability of our ecological systems, that they're very open to talking about wisdom. So that's the first step. And then the next step then is to say, well, okay, so if people are interested in wisdom, is it that they're interested in becoming wiser themselves as leaders or managers or workers or as entire organizations? And then to look at the situations that they find themselves in and go through that process of saying, okay, so what then are the kinds of capacities that we need to see them cultivate? So is it ethical reasoning or wise reasoning, as Justin talked about in his lecture a few weeks ago? Or is it something else? Is it something about innovation and creativity? Is it something to do with empathy, or whatever it happens to be? We need to do that kind of analysis. One of the things about wisdom is there's not a formula for it. There's no formula. Bernard, yes, sorry.
Sure. David, I was wondering if I might just come in on that, because Jagdish, I think, was looking for, how we might sort of practically implement that. And I was thinking about the course that Ali and I did over a number of years, a number of courses on wise leadership. And I think that if I could just very quickly say that there were a couple of elements that I think, could be actually applied in other areas, even in the workplace. But the first thing that we did was to just get the students to identify their values, but we did it in a roundabout way, which was to ask them what would they like said about them at their 70th birthday. And it was interesting that virtually no one said I want to be rich or anything like that, or powerful or famous. They were very, very much that they wanted to be remembered for caring, for loving, for those sorts of things, and for producing good in the world. So that was sort of heartening in that when you ask people the eudaimonic question, what do you ultimately want to do? Or it's more a teleological question. What do you actually want out of life? That it does get to that. And then what we then said, well, we just sort of distill that and said, well, that represents these sorts of values. And then we got them to go out and practice that. They had to go out and practice it for a week, practice some particular value. Some people, gave up eating meat for a week or something like that, and then even if they failed, we got them to reflect on it. Why did you fail, or why did it work, or those sorts of things. So to sum it all up, what I'm saying is that ultimately it's some sort of, what's your teleological purpose in life? What's the telos? What's the ultimate telos? And I can say that most times it is towards some eudaimonic or human flourishing outcome. And then what is it that you do that actually contributes to that, and then reflect on it. So that would be a couple of things, just general principles that I would say are important in, trying to get it in practice, to have it embodied in people's everyday practice. That's, for what it's worth, that's
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Varun, you're next.
Sure thing, David. Thank you for that lovely talk. So I was going to challenge you and Professor McKenna and Justin, all of who, by the way, I like Monica's scale. I like the social practical wisdom approach, and I like Justin's approach of wise reasoning. And the way I linked it together was wise reasoning is sort of the process by which one can develop the kinds of traits that Monica talks about. Social practical wisdom is a way by which one can apply those particular traits in a contextual manner, right? So I'm really happy that our panel of experts actually have three frameworks that fit very well together in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But the question I have is the following: when we talk about sort of the ontological and epistemological gaps, perhaps that wisdom thinking can address. So I'd like to take one particular problem and suggest to the wisdom scholars that maybe this is you can answer it around that. So let's take a existing social science problem of does diversity in the workplace result in better outcomes, right? I mean, this is a fairly researched area. There is an ontology that is used in the OB literature and OLS literature. There are multiple methods by which this particular problem has been studied, quantitative, qualitative, network analysis, etc. And in all cases, the results are always presented in a nuanced contextual manner, right? I mean, that diversity, this study shows that diversity has a positive outcome in such and such a situation, and scholars try to be narrow about their conclusions because they're trying to take context into account. Now, supposing we were to bring the wisdom mindset and everything we're talking about here today, an interesting thought problem for you guys would be, how do you take that problem or any other problem and say, well, what new ontological elements could we add to this particular discourse or discussion? What new epistemological elements drawn from quantum theory could we add to this? And if so, how would we study this particular problem in a different manner? Right? To me, that would make it practical in terms of, intuitively, I agree with what you guys are saying. But as a researcher, I would be a lot more convinced if you could give me an example of an existing research question that has been studied in multiple ways, and how that same research question might actually be studied in a different way, using some of the prescriptions that you guys have.
Okay, so that's a good question. So I guess with diversity, the kind of obvious thing is that when organizations decide that diversity matters, they get very, very different outcomes. There's a wide range of different outcomes, and some of them end up being quite disastrous, like it actually doesn't work. And then we see people marching around saying, well, diversity doesn't work, and we should ban any talk of diversity from organizations. So there's some organizations where diversity works really well. There's some organizations where it works moderately well, and there are other organizations where it actually makes things worse. So how can we reframe the way we look at diversity in the workplace so that we can understand better what are the contextual factors in different organizations that will either make it work or not work? And so a lot of people think, okay, so if I just hire a bunch of people from all different backgrounds, then suddenly innovation will increase and productivity will increase and the bottom line will increase. Some people will say, well, we just have to have more women in the workplace and that'll make everything better. Other people will say, well, we just need more people who have different, who come from different first language backgrounds. And other people will say, well, no, actually what we need to do is figure out how we manage diversity in the workplace. rather than how we get diversity. And it's not entirely clear to me how we could advise different firms who have never tried to introduce diversity or deliberately bring diversity into their workplace and predict what it is that they need to focus on to make it work. So how do we look at all the different contextual factors that might come together to create a particular kind of culture or mindset around the expectations about what needs to be done or how diversity actually works as a good OB or HR practice. So so if we could use the tools from social science, from quantum physics, we could actually design kind of mini experiments, or potentially in the future, we could model a particular organization and then bring in, gradually bring in different kinds of diversity, and we could begin to understand how that organization would react to it and whether that it's reacting in an overall positive or negative way, and where are the bottlenecks, or indeed are there zero bottlenecks in this particular kind of organization. So we just get much more. So Varun, you talk about, the subtlety of the way the researchers are talking about it, but there's also the subtlety of how you introduce those things into the workplace. And, I've lost track of the number of, master's level management students, MBA, Master of Management and so on, who have said, diversity doesn't work. And it's not that diversity doesn't work, it's just that you have to work for it to work. And people think that magically you just get these magic outcomes from suddenly saying, we're a diverse workplace. So I don't have the skills to know exactly how to model that. And
sorry to interrupt. So if you were to break the world into sort of the world of research or knowledge building and the world of application, I'm actually not talking about the world of application. I'm talking about the world of knowledge building and the use of wisdom-inspired ontology and epistemology, or quantum physics-inspired ontology and epistemology in knowledge building. So I just picked diversity at random. It really isn't any particularly favorite topic of mine or anything like that, right? My simple point is, you have a body of researchers or scholars that essentially investigate a particular research question. And I picked diversity and its effects as one, but it could be anything. And they use a set of standard social science methodologies in order to investigate that particular phenomenon, to contextualize it and to try and understand it, right? That's essentially what social scientists are doing. Now, we're making a claim in this particular seminar that there are methodological improvements that social scientists could bring to bear on this research question, were they to tap into the world of quantum physics and quantum investigation. And my question is, yes, it sounds intuitively right, but if you were to take this or any other research question, it would be wonderful and affirming if from scholars like yourselves, you were able to say specifically, here is how I would take this research question, and I would frame it in a completely different manner or a slightly different manner because I'm applying quantum thinking. And here's how I would investigate it in a different manner because I'm applying quantum thinking, not on the practice side, but as a research scholar side. Then you can walk into a room of 10 OB genius professors and say, this is what you guys have been missing. That's what I'm giving you guys a high challenge, but I think that's really what we should aim for.
Yeah, well, I think that's the people who are now adopting quantum-like social science methods are actually trying to do that. And what they're, so far what they're trying to do is set up experiments that have much more complicated sets of interacting variables. So a larger number of variables that interact in more complex and unpredictable ways than we would do in a normal experimental basis. So like if you take the prisoner's dilemma experiment, or they blow that up into something that's much more like reality. And so look, I'm not sure at the moment that I'm convinced that they're producing radically better results, but I think part of that is to do with just the infancy of this approach and the infancy of the ways in which they think about setting up their experiments, and also the conversion of the statistical tools into packages that people like us can actually use is still very, very rudimentary. So, but I'll try and pull out some of the research done on decision making, and you'll see how they have a very different approach to setting up their experimental designs. And I think they're going to only become more complex in the future. But also, I think in the future, what we're going to see is huge data sets taken from publicly available, statistical agencies to create very, very complex contexts in which we work, and be able to use that as a kind of superposition of interacting variables and channel them into impacting specific kinds of behaviors in specific kinds of actors. And I think if we look at the new revolutionary, the revolution that's going on around R statistics and Python and all of that sort of stuff, the capabilities are growing on a daily basis to the point where we can almost start to do things like that. So one of my colleagues at Macquarie is using Wikipedia as a proxy for a very large and complex superposition of knowledge in doing research on sociolinguistics. And so I think we're really in the infancy at the moment of this sort of research, and I can see the potential, and I'm not coming out and saying we've got the answers, the methodological answers yet, but I'm asking people to at least have a look at the potential, and if they can bring themselves to have a shot at it. I'm currently trying to find someone who can do computer programming, who could actually design something like SPSS for quantum social science, so that complete morons like me could actually pump some numbers in and get answers out at the other end without having to know how to do Python code.
Sure. Thank you. I think so. It's almost time. So despite I'm sure a lot of us will have a lot of questions, but given the constraint of time, I would like to thank you, Professor Rooney, for sharing such interesting and novel insights. And it was quite an enriching perspective. And definitely it has made all of us reflect over fundamental questions in research domain. So no doubt about it. And thanks everybody for your participation. It was wonderful having you here. So thank you.
And thank you,
Thanks.
everyone. And especially thank you to the people who asked questions.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.